Good morning. Welcome back to the second day of Iowa Ideas. Yesterday in the Energy and Environment track, we heard about DIY water testing, how to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, and how to protect ourselves from forever chemicals. In this session, we have a great panel lined up to talk about how we make progress on conservation practices in agriculture. I'm Erin Jordan, a reporter for the Gazette, and I will be moderating. If you have questions, please submit them through the Whova app, and we will try to integrate them into the conversation, which goes until 9:30. So thank you to our event sponsor, ITC Midwest, and thanks to the panel for making time to meet with us today. I'd like to ask our panelists to introduce themselves, sharing who they are and their connection to this topic. Let's start with Sylvia.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Sylvia Secchi. I'm a professor in the Department of Geographical and Sustainability Sciences at the University of Iowa. And I have been studying conservation policy and with a particular focus for this in this part of the world, the Corn Belt, for almost a quarter of a century now. I'm sad to report. So that's my connection to the topic.
Thank you. Ruth?
Yeah, Ruth Rabinowitz here, and I'm running my Oxbow Farms here in Madison County, Iowa, consisting of 4 farms in Iowa and 1 in Northeast South Dakota, which is quite different than Iowa. I have a degree in art and a permaculture design certificate, and my focus is healthy ecosystems on the farms with an emphasis of soil health, clean water, wildlife, pollinator habitat. My dad and I managed the farms together starting in 2012. From California, I now built a house and live on my farm in Iowa, a much better experience. And my crops are conventional corn, soybeans, a farm that is in its second year of transition to organic using alfalfa. And in South Dakota, we grew gorgeous sunflowers this year and small grains, and we're going to be grazing cattle. And before my management, all the farms had tillage, no cover crops, barely a grassed waterway, farming right to the trees, hardly any buffers at all. And since then, I have planted and restored tall grass prairie around my home and planted lots of Iowa native trees. All the farms are 100% no-till. 1 farm is still strip-tilled. All farms have conservation prairie buffers and grass waterways and are seeded with cover crops.
That's awesome. Mitchell?
Morning, everyone. Mitchell Hora. I'm 7th generation farmer in Washington County, Iowa. My family farms about 700 acres down here. I farm about 700 acres with my parents. We've been using no-till since 1978. We've been using cover crops since 2013, really just seeing those soil health gains. And with those soil health gains, we've been able to decrease our synthetic fertilizer by about 50%, decrease our pesticide use by about 75%, build up our organic matter and our soil organic carbon, reduce our carbon intensity score, which has been something really interesting due to Inflation Reduction Act tax credits. We have some of our farms where our carbon intensity score is negative 10.1. My corn that I just harvested 2 weekends ago. We're not harvesting corn today. It's raining down here in Southeast Iowa today. I'm sure a lot of you in Iowa on the call are getting some rain today too, which is great. But get our cover crop up and going. But my corn here this year scored a CI score of negative 4.1. So really watching that and trying to tell our story better, which is the other hat that I wear. I'm the founder and CEO of Continuum Ag. We're a software company helping farmers implement regenerative ag practices and document the practices that they implement, run scores like carbon intensity, and help farmers tell that story in data-connected supply chains.
Thank you. And Scott?
Yes, good morning, everybody. I'm the Assistant State Conservationist for Partnerships for Iowa. My job is to manage the grants and agreements where we work with partners to provide funding to several of our different programs outside of EQIP and CSP and some of the other programs that we traditionally use. Background, I'm from Mississippi, if you can't already tell that. Had a 19-year career with Extension. Prior to that, I had worked for run a couple of sow farms and some beef cattle production. But the county I worked in Mississippi was one of the most diverse agriculture counties in the nation. We pretty much, if it grows and we sell it, we grew it. So I've got an extensive background working with producers, and now I've had the privilege for the last almost 4 years to be here in Iowa working with our partners to get conservation on the ground.
That's great. So I want to start off with our farmers, our landowners here, and just ask each of them a kind of a question about their experience. Ruth, you talked in your intro just about converting, doing a lot of this work on the land within the last few years, taking the land that had been tilled and reducing that. Can you tell us what the most challenging thing has been of that process?
I have been doing this work for about 12 years now, and this is only my first or second or third year with cover crops. And so that's been really frustrating how long that took. And I think the data is out there that about 60% of the land in Iowa is rented. And about 50% of that, of land in Iowa, farmland in Iowa, is owned or co-owned by women. And so it just took a long time. I was talking to these tenants that did not want to do cover crops, and the barriers were really there. That the expense was huge. They were like, well, maybe I can get to it sometime. I can't, and I'm not sure. And as soon as like the Inflation Reduction Act and the EQIP really came through with the grants that I needed, and I actually changed tenants because I tried to work with those people for a super long time and be patient. And then as soon as I built my house and got here, I got new tenants. And then it was written into the leases, this was going to happen, mandatory. And so that's been the frustrating part, is I would have liked to have had a decade of cover crops behind me already, where I'm in year 1, 2, 3, but cup half full. I'm there. It's happening. And the funding's there, and it's been great. And I've got new people that are excited to be on land and have the opportunity to farm my farm.
That's great. Now, Mitchell, it's you. I think the crowd here probably is familiar with, cover crops and what they look like. But if you could just give a little bit of description about what you guys have done down there in Washington County, and maybe how the cover crop environment may have it's shifting somewhat.
Yeah, Washington County, Iowa, where we live and farm, is an interesting place because there's more cover crop acreage here than anywhere else in the state. When we started using cover crops, or when we were really digging into it, that 2015 kind of time frame, there was actually more cover crop here in Washington County than all other 98 counties combined. So really, really at the cutting edge. And still, my understanding today is we're about 3 times more cover crop in Washington County than any other county in Iowa. So still up there on the leading edge, but of course the momentum is really continuing to pick up, and a lot of other folks are adopting cover crops. But to Ruth's point, it takes time. This stuff does not happen overnight, and it can't happen overnight because the equipment's not there, the seed's not there, and the know-how, the knowledge is definitely lacking as far as to be able to implement these things correctly and not lose money, which is where we struggled at the beginning, that we didn't know exactly how to implement cover crops correctly, what species, what rate, how do we set our drill the correct way, how do we manage this. We lost about $100 an acre in year 1 of adopting cover crops. Luckily, we tried at small scale and didn't, bet the whole farm in year 1. And we were able to utilize data and connect with other people to understand that we were the problem. We didn't do it correctly. And now that we've learned and adjusted and experimented, now we're having massive success in using covers, especially in an extreme dry year like we had this year. But I'm just seeing farmers, continuing to see, okay, there's farms that have been at this for quite a while. They're sticking with it. It's working. Their crop looks good. They don't have a lot of weeds. Our neighbors are seeing this stuff, and those later adopters are starting to really come to the table. But they need help, and they want to be risk adverse. They can't spend a lot of money doing this stuff. Maybe they can tap into some cost share. Maybe they can, get in line for a carbon program or some type of a environmental outcome or sustainability program. But it still takes understanding how to logistically implement these practices to enable the economic outcomes to shine through.
And Sylvia, I was hoping you could maybe talk with us a little bit about the ways that cover crops work in terms of potentially, I know they improve water quality, but also, in terms of soil resiliency, kind of the science behind that?
Yeah, so I want to go back to what Ruth said, that the Inflation Reduction Act really provided a boost because there were billions of extra dollars for the EQIP program, and the EQIP program is a cost share. Scott can probably regale you with the details that essentially subsidizes the implementation of these programs, these practices. The main issue with cover crops is that they are really good, a good practice, a good best management practice for things like you said, in terms of reducing soil erosion, improving water quality. Unfortunately, this extra money that's coming from the Inflation Reduction Act is for climate change mitigation. And for that, they are terrible. There is no consensus in the literature that actually the soil organic carbon that they sequester is additional, and they are an impermanent or annual practice. So we are only receiving these benefits on an annual basis. It's not like planting trees where you have much longer time horizons. So the problem is that we're doing this good thing to achieve a goal that will not be achieved. We want to subsidize things that are less permanent because they are less challenging for the agricultural system we have. And we don't want to fix the upstream problems that we have. We are subsidizing farmers to pollute because we're subsidizing farmers to grow corn and soybeans using a ton of artificial fertilizer that essentially is very intensive in greenhouse gas emissions. And then we're subsidizing them again to reduce the pollution that we have paid them to generate. It is a completely inefficient system. And because of the practices that we have chosen to subsidize, it is also ineffective. We are wasting money on things that don't work. So I think it behooves us to be honest with people about the limits of cover crops, which, as I said, we wouldn't need so much cover crops if we weren't growing all this corn that is going into ethanol, which has a very inefficient technology. And we're now trying to make it look better by forcing people to have pipelines on their lands. This is the kind of like big picture discussion we need to have, not just looking at cover crops in isolation, because we are wasting a lot of public money on this thing.
Okay, you're like taking all of our discussion in that one comment. So that's but that's a great place to start, kind of laying the groundwork there for what are some of the nuances of this conservation practices conversation. Scott, would you talk with us a little bit about how the Natural Resources Conservation Service through the federal government helps support conservation practices?
Yes, we have several different programs, and yes, there's no one silver bullet that's going to cure all our aches and pains. And we have to produce corn, soybeans, food to feed the world. And yes, some goes to ethanol, some goes to food, some goes all over. And unfortunately, we have to use synthetic fertilizers to promote that production. Now, is it managed in the proper way on every farm? No. Are there a lot of things we can do to help farmers embrace new ideas and new technologies to mitigate some of the consequences of using fertilizer? Yes. And that's what we try to do with USDA programs. We're making impacts in the watersheds that we have our programs, and we have one program called the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, where our partners are taking that conservation dollars and they're out there working with producers on the land. They're working in watersheds to help clean up the water. And every one of those programs and projects has a requirement to report the benefits of what did this money do. And the partners also have a match requirement to bring to the table. So it's not just our money, it's the partners' money also being invested to try to clean up the water. But I'll give you an example. A lot of folks don't understand soil structure and the importance of it. Well, my father, who worked for AT&T for 57 years, believe it or not, He moved to the country to retire, and he bought a small tractor and he bought a rototiller because he wanted a garden. So he plowed and he plowed and he plowed every week, every day for about 3 months because he wanted this fine, silty soil to produce a garden. Well, he planted his garden and plants came up about that tall and they quit growing because he had destroyed that soil structure. So on repeated plowing, that's what can happen. Soil has to have air pockets. It has to have nutrients. It has to have decaying organic matter to be productive. To get that message across is sometimes very difficult, and that's the key. Is first understand what you're dealing with and getting that education out there, which I think NRCS does a very good job of promoting throughout the state. You still are going to have traditional farmers that was the way that their ancestors farmed, and they're going to fire up the tractor and drop the disc in the ground, and there's not a whole lot we can do about that. We also run into an instance where we have producers that, well, you're the government. We don't want you telling me how to run my farm. Okay, fair enough. Well, that's one benefit we have through our RCPP, or the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, is we can contract with the partner to work with that producer one-on-one. They contract, they help them put the installation of the practices in, and we have very little role other than ensuring that we're meeting NEPA and all the other requirements we have to do with all of our programs. So there's a lot of work going on that hasn't fully been exposed yet, that we're cleaning up the problems that have been here for years. But until we recognize that we need to change and we start figuring out a way to develop a culture of conservation, not just cover crops, not just bioreactors, not just, hey, we'll show up and stick this on your farm if you'll let us, but convincing producers that this is the way to farm. And that's the main purpose behind our programs, is to give them some help to try things out. And everything we promote is based on land grant university studies. It's not stuff we snatched out of the air. It's stuff that has been tried and proven on university research. And we have standards and practices that have to be held. Even if partners are doing our work, then they have to follow our practices and standards. And they've been proven over time with scientific data. So there's no one silver bullet. There's a lot of issues, and you can get into why we're producing this or that or whatever. But the whole deal is we have producers that feed the world, not just us. They feed everybody around this world, and the world needs it. And so we need to do everything we can to help them produce and help them understand that there's different ways to farm. There's benefits of conservation, and it may take time to get there. And that's another issue we run into, was regardless of how you want to look at, a producer is paid by the pound. Whether it's a pound of corn, pound of soybeans, pound of beef, pound of pork, that's how they're paid. The more pounds they have, the more income they have for the year. So anything you do to negate that poundage that they're raising that year, why would they? You know, how's this benefiting me? You know, I have bills to pay. And it's not just the bills they pay, but all the companies and the organizations that they keep alive because they use their services. So, and on top of all that, you have to think from a producer standpoint is, first of the year, I plow the ground or I plant the ground. I put a ton of money into seed and fertilizer and chemicals and everything I have to do to be productive. And if it doesn't rain, or I have witnessed personally in 2009, the crops in Mississippi, 90% of the corn, 90% of the cotton, 90% of the soybeans, 90% of the sweet potatoes were destroyed because it started raining in July and then stopped in December. How do you pay your bills?
Yeah, no, those are very good questions. Yeah, Scott, I wanted to dip back because you're mentioning just the challenges that farmers face. Just some questions from the audience already for our panelists. You know, some questions about cover crops. If, you know, our cover crops, a lot of them, you know, they're grown over the fall and winter and into the spring, and then usually killed off before corn or soybeans will be planted. Is it still considered regenerative if you're using herbicides to kill off those cover crops? I don't know, you know, Mitchell, if you want to take that one.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Definitely something that comes up a lot. And I think, you know, we got to kind of differentiate here between regenerative, which doesn't necessarily have a key definition, but I'll come back to it on what my definition is. But there's regenerative and then there's organic. And in organic, there's a clear definition where you can't utilize a big list of things. You can't use GMOs, you can't use seed treatments, you can't use pesticides, you can't use synthetic fertilizer. But in order to manage weeds and pests and the issues that we face daily on the farm, the options that are left oftentimes include tillage to take care of weeds and to maybe incorporate that cover crop, or to be able to keep the weeds out of the system and avoid those issues. So they err on the side of tillage rather than utilize the pesticide. In regenerative farming, my definition is that it's the continual implementation of the principles of soil health. Soil health principle number one is minimize disturbance, both chemical and physical disturbance. The other key piece is maintain living roots, foster diversity, integrate livestock, maintain soil armor, those other principles. So step number, the key of regenerative ag though is protect that soil and don't disturb that soil. So don't till. So if we're not going to till to terminate the cover crop, yes, we use a herbicide. Like I mentioned before, we've reduced our herbicide need though by about 75%, because now these cover crops that we're growing, mostly cereal rye, it's extremely easy to kill. We can use it with a very low rate of herbicide. We've experimented with a lot of different herbicides. However, Roundup, glyphosate continues to be the easiest, the cheapest, and the product that we can use the least amount to get the outcome. We've tried other products as well, like Gramoxone, for example, which is really, really nasty stuff, and a variety of other pesticides too that are older and not as effective. So we're trying to utilize as little as possible. On our farm, what we do, we never terminate early, which is what the recommendations are still coming out of our NGOs and out of our universities and stuff. I think there's opportunity there to be able to expand that and allow farmers to have more flexibility to plant green and delay their termination. On corn, we wait usually around 10 days before we terminate our cover crops on corn, which means we're planting our cover crops now and we won't terminate them till middle of May. We'll plant the corn at the end of April or 1st of May. We won't terminate till the end of May. So that cover crop will be about 24 inches tall at the time that we terminate it. On soybeans, we're planting the cover crop now. Following corn harvest, we'll plant the soybeans in April, and we won't terminate that cover crop until the end of May or the 1st of June, when it'll be about 5 foot tall, really maximizing the amount of biomass that we can get. And by maximizing the biomass, we're maximizing the weed suppression and able to reduce the synthetic fertilizer that we use, which of course for us means more dollars kept in our pocket. We don't need to spend the money on pesticides that we don't need, but also we can really maximize those soil health gains, utilize the pesticide to control the weeds, minimize the amount that we're putting on to try to mitigate against some of the adverse effects. And there definitely are some. I mean, Roundup is a bacterialicide. I thoroughly understand that. It's just that we've used as little as 12 ounces of Roundup, so one pop can across an entire acre is all we need to terminate our cover crops. That small amount, yes, it's going to kill some microbes, but way fewer than I would kill if I utilized an alternative method like tillage.
Okay, thank you. Another question related to cover crops for Ruth before we'll maybe kind of shift gears a little bit. Ruth's question is, when you have new tenants, were you adjusting the amount of rent to kind of counter those extra costs for implementing cover crops in the early years?
Yeah, it's all early years still. Year 2 with a lot of them. Yeah, every lease is a little different. I have a pretty long lease, and I have kind of a blank area for cover crops. Okay, so I did get grants pretty much for all my farms for cover crops. So I am personally ordering the seed, ordering the aerial application, or getting the seed to the planter of the farmer that's going to chase the combine. And yeah, my rent is definitely on the lower side. I have a flex lease that I use a co-manager, Next Gen Ag. So I actually won't get left behind. So if I, try to crystal ball it, I'm probably going to be high rent, but I have a lower rent and then I ride the commodity wave and ride the yield wave. And if we have timely rains and we have a good market, I may get a bonus on my acres. And that probably this year I will, I think. We had some pretty good rains in southern Iowa. And I think it's super fair because that farmer is, they're always at risk. They have to go to their bank and say, Ruth wants this really large rent, or Ruth just wants this smaller rent. And then I get to share, if the reality manifests where we actually have a good crop and good prices, then I get that a reward too. And I pretty much put it right back into the farm. So I think, not everyone can charge lower rent, but I am living on the simpler side. But yeah, all of our costs go up, insurance, taxes, all these things. But I just believe in getting conservation on the land so badly that I want to motivate my tenants to do the right thing. And pretty much all of them terminate. I don't pay for the termination. So they're doing that as part of, that's their lift on the contract.
That's really cool. I could see a lot of people taking notes, or I could imagine that, but that's kind of cool. So another question from the audience, and I could see, I could imagine Sylvia, because I've heard her podcast. I could hear her thinking this as well. Just the idea, Scott, you had said that Iowa feeds the world. I think a lot of people resent that statement. They don't think it's accurate. They say an ISU report found that Iowa imports 80% of the food, or 86% of the food we eat. How can we grow more of our own food here? And what benefits would that provide to our land and water?
Yeah, I think that is a great question. And I think that whether we want or not, that type of issue is coming, because places west of us, like California and Arizona, are going to have trouble because of climate change, producing the vegetables, producing the alfalfa that they have been producing. While here, we're relatively insulated. I mean, as bad as flooding and droughts are in Iowa, they don't compare with the kind of crisis regarding water and drought that they have in Arizona. And so I just think that in my quarter century here, what I have seen is people being extremely reactive and passive and just waiting for the disaster to strike before we respond. And we could do so much better in terms of the incentives we provide farmers to diversify, in terms of the money that we spend in the farm bill, in terms even, I mean, things that go from like the school lunches to institutional purchases. We used to do a lot more at the state level, even in Iowa. There's so much more that we could do to diversify. And yes, I think that I'm happy to see that people are getting this message that feeding the world is really a first of all, the world wants to feed itself, okay? We used to feed the world because we used to have too much extra product. PL 480 was about food colonialism. I don't think we want to feed the world that way. I think we want to give people in the rest of the world the tool to eat culturally appropriate food. And we want to feed ourselves in healthier ways for the soil, for the farmers, and for the local communities. So being proactive and changing policy to make that happen, I think that's the real issue.
So going to Scott, what do you think are the ways that the USDA can maybe encourage more diversity of crops here in Iowa?
Well, they already are. I mean, they set up the urban ag department lab about 2 years ago, and they're encouraging small scale producers that live in the cities or close to the cities that are supplying a lot of the farmers markets. Iowa soils, Iowa temperatures, the growing season for vegetables is kind of limited. You can do it, and we've got success stories all over the state where producers are raising vegetables and selling them locally. When I'm talking about feeding the world, I'm talking about the grains going down the Mississippi River. I know we're not stacking them up in my backyard, so we're feeding somebody with it. But there's opportunities for every producer to diversify their portfolio on their farm and do what they want to do. But we can't force them to do something. If it's everything we do, all of our practices, everything, all of our programs are voluntary. So if a producer wants to delve off into something, we have the expertise to help them get there and be successful. But that's another thing that a lot of folks don't understand about our agency or about extension is you have professionals that have the education to help you change or help you put different crops in or help you develop markets. You can grow it all day long, but if you can't sell it, what you gonna do with it? So there's a lot of little things that folks don't consider where they just think it's an automatic, hey, we can make our own food. Well, we can, and we do for the most part. But depending on what soil types you have, depending on what kind of temperature you have, you may be limited by factors you can't control. Now, there's ways around that. We have programs where we supply high tunnels. You can get an earlier growing season or a later growing season. You can be very successful on a small scale feeding your local community. That's a lot of what we need to be looking at is building these communities up to they can support themselves and that they can sell locally and encourage them, the consumer, to understand the producer and where their food's coming from and how it's handled. So there's lots of ways that we can expand agriculture and keep food locally and do a lot of good for the folks in Iowa and around the world. But got to reach out and ask.
That's great. So yeah, just regarding that, reaching out and asking, I recently got some data from the USDA that shows there's still a lot of unmet need in terms of people applying for EQIP and CSP funding that may not get it in the first year and maybe have to reapply. Scott, how do you see the Inflation Reduction Act changing that, if at all?
Then
Looks like you're freezing up a little.
the Inflation Reduction Act is actually providing a lot more funding for us to. Okay, you got me now?
Yeah, we got you.
Okay. The Inflation Reduction Act is providing a tremendous amount of funding levels we've never seen before, and we're able to expand. We do have a process, though. Once a producer goes into our offices, they sign up for our programs, and it's not an automatic, I want cover crops, I want no-till, I want whatever. There's a planning process. NRCS was founded on a 9-step planning model, and that model takes into consideration everything about that farm, not just, hey, we're going to do cover crops. From there, after the plan is developed, those producers are put into a ranking process. The ranking process was developed to try to be fair to everyone, not just to say, well, this is a big producer, we're going to give them all the money, or this is a small producer, we're going to give them all the money. It is after that ranking process is developed based on the plan that you had with your district conservationist, then the awards are made and they're ranked. You go right down the list, and we run into instances where producers signed up. The process takes too long sometimes, and they give up, and that goes against us. That shows that, well, we know we're not reaching a lot of producers. There's so many factors that go into that sometimes the data is a little skewed. We're doing all we can to help producers. Again, we run into other instances where producers don't want to fool with us because we're the government. But, you can give us all the money in the world, but we're only going to be able to do what people want to embrace and what we're able to do fairly. We can't just go out willy-nilly and start handing out money to people. That'll get you in trouble real quick. So, there's a lot of opportunity for us to expand. There's a lot of opportunity for us to help a lot of people. If they want to be helped, they can come ask us, and we'll be glad to share that knowledge.
And Ruth or Mitchell, I don't know if you guys have any experience with EQIP or CSP and trying to seek those funds.
I was going to chime in that the first place I went to in 2012 was NRCS, and they just saved me. I mean, it was just, they got me out in trucks. We got to look at the land. I mean, before that, we would literally drive a sedan to the edge of the farm with my dad and look across a cornfield, and we didn't see anything, and we couldn't see erosion. There was erosion up to my knees. We had no idea what was going on. I think I put in like 25 grass waterways, with NRCS's help. A lot of those are conservation waterways. it's the best thing ever. I mean, you need to go there if you haven't and make friends with your NRCS. I'm doing an oxbow restoration. We're meeting out soon on my 7-acre oxbow in Clark County with my dirt worker and the engineer. I doubled my conservation ground. I took all the land that was, red zone, marginal lands, D slopes, topography was bad, all in pheasant safe, duck habitat, quail habitat, you name it. I've got hunting back on my farms. I've got quail, I've got pheasant, I've got, all the deer you could want, turkey. That's another income stream I'm getting, right, with hunting leases that I didn't have before, because there's actually living animals back on the farm thanks to conservation programs. So it's been phenomenal. And now with the transition to organic, my farmer just got a 5-year, I think it's an EQIP contract, incentivizing him to go organic with this alfalfa. And it's very good funding. And I would like to grow food. I'm 20 minutes from Des Moines. This is a field that's flat. It's like 80, 90 CSR, corn suitability rating. It's excellent, excellent soil. It'll be organic, and I don't see why in the world we can't grow food for stores in Iowa and restaurants. So I can't change all my acres at one time, but I can tinker around with, 10 or 12 acres, which is actually a large, farm to grow food. A lot of these food farms are 2, 3, 4 acres, right? So NRCS has been helping me with all of these aspects of my business, and I'm getting there. It's a slow road. I'm working as diligently as I can, and they're helping me. But I highly recommend NRCS to everybody here.
Can I just interject for a second and remind every listener here that by law, 50% of EQIP has to go to livestock producers. So we have confined animal feeding operations getting subsidies for building manure pits, is all I want to say. So Ruth's story is one story, but let's not forget how that money is disbursed in general.
So yeah, I mean, I don't know, Scott, if you want to speak to that or not, just the idea that, some people, like the idea of what's covered under these programs is not everyone agrees with every practice that gets funding, right? I mean, there are things that.
Yeah. Absolutely not. And that's why it's a volunteer program. If you want to volunteer and strap these programs on and try to own your farm, that's what we're here for, is to help you do that. And yes, EQIP may have 50% going to livestock manure, but that's not the only program we have. So we have other opportunities for producers to embrace conservation and put it on their farms.
Do you think there's any, I mean, I'm guessing not, but any movement to, because of the concerns about over application of manure in some places, parts of the state where you have high density of the animal confinements, is there any movement to perhaps reduce some of that funding for large scale animal production?
Not that I know of. I mean, we can't tell a producer they can't produce. If they're in production or they're expanding production or reducing, that's their business. If we can help them put in conservation practices to help mitigate some of that, that's what we're here to do. Cover crops will mitigate a lot of that. Animal manure is an excellent fertilizer. In the South, we use a lot of poultry manure out of poultry houses. It's an excellent fertilizer. It's slow release and it breaks down by enzymes in the soil. So, there's benefits to manure if it's applied right, and the folks that are doing it have to fill out management plans with the state, and they do the best they can to manage it.
Okay. I want to shift gears a little bit. We talked about Inflation Reduction Act briefly, but Mitchell, I interviewed you this summer about a new tax credit called 45Z that is a tax credit for producing clean transportation fuel. What does that have to do with agriculture and conservation?
Yeah, 40% of the corn grown in this country goes to produce ethanol. In a lot of cases, 1 bushel of corn produces 3 gallons of ethanol. Plus, it produces DDGs, which are dried distillers grains that are fed back to livestock. It also produces corn oil, which can be utilized in that livestock feed, or now it can be utilized in things like sustainable aviation fuel. We're capturing the CO2 coming off of that, can utilize that CO2 for food and beverage purposes. There's sometimes you can take that ethanol and you can take it further to create sustainable aviation fuel, or to create food grade, create alcohol coming off it for sanitary purposes, or even food grade. Lot of products that can come by producing those renewable fuels, producing it here locally in Iowa. And a gallon of gasoline has a carbon footprint or carbon intensity score of around 100. The average gallon of ethanol has a carbon intensity score of 55.5. With the Inflation Reduction Act 45Z tax credit, ethanol producers and any transportation biofuel, they're incentivized to get their CI score below 50. And as they go from 50 all the way down to 0, they earn tax credits based on their actual carbon intensity score of the gallon of gasoline, okay, or of gallon of ethanol that's actually produced. So instead of being fossil fuel that's fueling a lot of our vehicles today, we can cut that in half by utilizing more locally grown renewable energy, renewable fuel. Today, 50% of the carbon footprint of a gallon of ethanol comes from the corn. So ethanol, I mentioned, has a score of 55.5 is the national average. National average carbon intensity of corn is 29.1. Because of the 45Z tax credit, now there's a interest in enabling farmers to lower their carbon intensity score, thus lowering the carbon intensity score of the gasoline or the ethanol that's being produced with that corn. On my farm, I mentioned some of our corn has a score of negative 10.1. So instead of being an emitter to the tune of 29.1, our use of cover crops, no-till, reduced synthetic fertilizer, reduced diesel fuel, reduced inputs, our score is negative 10.1. So as we are producing, we're actually offsetting some of the production of the ethanol via the farming practices we're implementing. Continuum Ag is helping farmers to get their score. Most farmers believe that what they're doing right now is sustainable. They believe that what they're doing is fine. They're making money. They're passing along the farm to the next generation. They think that they're doing okay. Now, with the carbon intensity opportunity, we can finally show farmers, here's a score. Here's your actual impact. And a lot of farmers are emitting, and they don't know it. They think that what they're doing is sustainable. But like I mentioned, the average farmer has a carbon intensity score, losing carbon to the tune of a score of 29.1. Our average farmer that we're working with has a score today of 8. Okay, is the average farmer that we're working with today, a score of 8. So we can really start to put those numbers on it, encourage farmers to continue to adopt practices that are going to reduce their carbon intensity, be able to provide renewable, non-fossil fuel energy right here with all these additional food and other byproducts coming out of the production of these fuels.
Yeah, I think that is it really interesting. The first time I heard that from you, it's really great to kind of hear how that tax credit plays out. I don't know that everyone agrees with kind of the path, in terms of sustaining ethanol and the large amount of corn production. But I think that the side effect of that could be more conservation on the land. So far, we've mostly offered incentives to encourage conservation, but given the still relatively low adoption rate of cover crops and no-till and everything, is there any sort of like a stick approach needed? If the government were to have some regulation, is there some sort of government action that could be taken that doesn't involve just giving money to people?
On my side, I think it's a really bad idea because we're not set up to do it. Like I mentioned before, like if the regulation—
Mitch, come on, we're already doing it. Conservation compliance has been in existence for decades now. It covers 30% of American farmland. You could extend conservation compliance to all acres.
So
if you have proper monitoring, it works. Come on, we're not set up for doing it.
So you're talking CRP, you're talking Conservation Reserve Program? Is that what you're talking-
Conservation compliance.
Conservation compliance
Yeah,
program. Okay,
I
so-
actually had that situation when I first took on management. I was driving farms with the NRCS and they said, wow, you need like waterways here. This is pretty bad. And the neighbors complaining about their pond and it's ditching out and running and bleeding out, all this dirt everywhere. And my farmer did not make that meeting, like didn't show up. It was me and the DC. And so I wasn't able to get cost share. I wasn't able to get a CRP waterway. I got slapped with, you got to correct this completely on your own and put in grass waterways, 100% your cost. And kind of the takeaway was if the farmer had showed up, and I don't know how that could have played out differently. And that was a big cold shower for me of like, whoa, so that it exists, and we got it done. We fixed it. So it's good to get ahead of the ball, and be on the right side of that. But I guess the neighbor had been complaining for a while before I took on management and letters and stuff. I had no idea what was happening. So that was a stick approach. It worked and it was painful and we got it done and we moved on. And so everything else has been either state cost share or CRP, grass waterways for the most part. I really, really love my buffers. I put 30-foot buffers around every farm on all sides, pretty much, at least 3 sides. And the tractors are away from the tree roots. It gives the wildlife somewhere to be. And then the big storms come and I'm keeping all my topsoil. It's like a backstop plug, before it gets the ditch. So I highly recommend those.
Thank you for that example of how that compliance angle works or can work. Mitchell, did you want to have anything else to say on that point?
Yeah, I'm not seeing these like stick things actually being followed through. If they are some of it, like we never even run into it. The program that you had mentioned, like I'm not even seeing it being out there and being implemented. So maybe it is there. I'm not seeing it. So maybe, if there is something there, I just don't know how it's being actually implemented. And obviously if there's 30%, like we don't have that adoption of these practices. If they are being mandated to the tune of 30% or in this, obviously we don't have these practices being adopted on that percentage of ground. So I don't know that if we can point to that it's working, or I don't know. But my point being on, especially within no-till and cover crops and stuff like that, the main thing is if we force people to go do this stuff, a lot of farms are not going to be able to comply with like some of the heavy costs and stuff like that. Like Ruth shared in her story, especially if we're talking about other practices too, more costly practices that are also going to be implemented. It's going to run a lot of small family farms out of business too. If we continue to force people to do some of these things that they're not set up to do, they don't have the technical support to be able to not end up losing money. There's still a lot of farms that are adopting these practices and can go backwards and can lose a lot of money chasing the stick. And I think we're seeing that with a lot of the disasters that farmers had this year with drought, that there's a lot of crappy looking crop and a lot of farms that are not going to adopt cover crops this fall because of the issues that they had here this year. They were gung-ho and did a lot of these no-till and cover crop practices last year. And then the technical support wasn't there and they had drought and they're losing money. So we've got to be able to really encourage, I think, data is key, cross collaborating, learning from others, being able to exemplify the stories and the data and the outcomes, the information that is working, and also share where we learned from our mistakes and where we didn't make it work. I'm seeing the flywheel continue to accelerate. When I got into this, there was less than 500,000 acres of cover crops in Iowa. Now we're at 3 million. No-till as well, over, I don't know if we're getting close to 50%. No-till adoption here now in Washington County, we're nearly 75% no-till. So, seeing these things really continue to go, it just, it does. It takes some time, but I'm seeing a lot of now the industry also coming in, pulling as much as we're pushing from the ground up too.
What do you
Erin,
think?
can I give some historical context about conservation compliance?
Sure.
Conservation compliance and the institution of the Conservation Reserve Program in the 1985 Farm Bill are credited for reducing soil erosion that had been a century-old problem in large parts of the United States. And it's about 50-50, half for conservation compliance and half conservation reserve program helped with this. What we have seen, though, that Mitchell so eloquently illustrated is a terrible drop. I wrote a paper on this in 2020 in enforcement of conservation compliance. And so actually soil erosion rates in the United States are going up again for the first time since 1985 because we're not monitoring a program that we have had in the Farm Bill consistently since 1985. So we need to have these programs and we need to monitor them.
Okay, let's go to Scott. We're hearing maybe this program is not being monitored, doesn't have as much enforcement as it could. I don't know if you have any perspective on that.
Just vaguely familiar with CRP. Yes, once somebody enrolls into the program, they're required to follow the guidelines, and we are required, or at FSA, for CRP, our Farm Service Agency, that's their program. They're required to go out and make sure everything's being followed to the letter. And sometimes that doesn't happen. Sometimes it's staffing. Sometimes it's just, things get away. Every practice we do, farmer has to do them to our standards, and we go back and verify that they were put into those standards. A lot of our practices have a lifespan. At the end of that lifespan, the farmer can go back to doing whatever they want to do, or they can renew it or fix it or whatever. I don't think beating farmers with a stick to get them into compliance is the answer. I think we have a lot of institutions and a lot of good partners in the state, and one of them's Practical Farmers Iowa. They're doing a lot for education with producers and helping them understand the benefits of conservation. And I think if you start getting back what I talked about earlier, is developing a culture of conservation instead of requiring everybody to go into conservation, I think you'll get a lot further in the long haul. That may take more visits to the NRCS office. That may take, whether you sign up for the program or not, that's a great resource just to come out to your farm and say, hey, here's some things we can do. Yes, you may have to fix some stuff before we can help you, because we have to be responsible with the tax dollars we spend. But at least you would know what your farm needed. If you don't want a federal agency telling you, there's extension in every county, or you have specialists on campus that can come and talk to you about what your farm needs. If you're really interested in changing, those are two great resources. Whatever you do, don't get on Google and start looking up wonderful ways to fix the world. I mean, there's science-based data out there that the land-grant universities generate every day that can help you make good decisions, to be profitable, to enhance wildlife habitat, to make that soil health work, to improve water quality, and all you got to do is reach out and get it.
Okay, so you mentioned kind of the long haul, building this culture of conservation. I think that sounds great and is great if that happens. But we have had voluntary practices for decades, and we're seeing some urgency in terms of soil loss rates increasing. Just our climate change predicament we're facing in the world. So I wonder, what do you guys think, Mitchell, Ruth, about the idea of required stream buffer, just where nothing's planted right up to stream beds? You wouldn't be saying you gotta plant cover crops, but just saying you can't plant within like 10 feet of the stream beds.
Yeah, I noticed that right away, even as a lay person and super green and new 12 years ago to farming. I was out, four-wheelers looking at crop that went right up to a stream bank, and chunks of soil looked like they were falling in. And I'm like, this does not look right. And I didn't even know. And so I think it was the DNR biologist or somebody designed buffers, at least 20-foot buffers. And we put those everywhere. Every creek, every stream has buffers. It makes total sense. And I think they should totally be mandatory. Absolutely. And then there's corridors for the wildlife, and you have the filtration, and it's going to stabilize it with the prairie, the deep roots of, big blue stem that goes 12, 15, 20 feet, can live forever. I mean, we've seen the roots at the Tallgrass Prairie Center. I think it's a fantastic idea.
My hot take on it is I think there's a balance to this. Minnesota has this already, and they have mandatory buffers. They're pretty big ones too. I think, Ruth, you're talking 10 to 20 feet in a lot of cases is probably good enough. I don't recall exactly what their
I think
number
it's
is, but
50. I think
50
it's
foot. That's
50
what I was
is
gonna say. I thought I had that in my head. Okay, so yeah, 50 foot. I think my biggest thing, my takeaway is I think it shouldn't be a blanket one size fits all on every single in every single case. Like there's some places like Ruth is talking, and we have them on our farm too. There's some cases where they make a lot of sense, and we do it on our own because we know that they make a lot of sense. But having it be blanket one size fits all, I don't think that's the approach. I think it's in the middle somewhere where it's identifying where are those stream banks that do need some protection. Let's utilize some cost share tools or something like that to step in and protect those. There's other places where the topography doesn't fit the right way or where there's other practices being implemented or whatnot. It's an example that mitigate the need for, at least for the aggressive buffer. That there's probably a blend approach that is the right thing here. The biggest piece in a lot of this is, my initial take was if we're going to be mandated to do certain things, my land cost today is over $500 an acre. Like I've got to continue to figure out how am I going to pay the mortgage on the land when just my land cost every year is $500 an acre. So I've got to figure out how to be profitable and be productive if I want to stay in business.
Okay, we've got just about 4 minutes left, so I wanted to just ask each of you to just kind of briefly share something that you think is a promising development, whether that's something you're trying on your farm, new research you've seen, anything that you think is a promising development in conservation practices. And we've got to do it kind of briefly because there's only a couple minutes. So someone want to start?
I can I hit on mine, 45Z, the carbon intensity piece. I don't necessarily think that it should be tax credits long term, but this really sets a precedent, giving farmers finally a scoreboard, showing them a transparent point system and rewarding them for scoring points. Scott brought it up before. Today, we get paid based on the outcome of our production in terms of bushels. Now we finally, for the first time, have the opportunity to directly be compensated for some of these additional outcomes, namely our carbon intensity outcome. I think that's really important. Relay cropping is my other favorite thing, but that's a whole different deal.
Okay, well, if you want to talk about relay cropping, maybe we can talk about that on Huva or something later. But yeah, that's okay. Ruth.
I am now a tall grass prairie enthusiast. I can see it right out my window here. I've planted 2 acres. 51 species around my home. It was corn soybean world. It had 1 year of an oats crop and then it went right in. And I want people in cities to plant tall grass prairie. I want people to get rid of their lawns, stop putting chemicals on it, stop mowing it, stop using the gasoline, and plant native Iowa species. It helps everything from the famous, monarch butterfly to all the species that are the pheasant that are living in there. It's deep rooted. It's going to filter all kinds of things. It's going to clean up the pond water that's right below it. I just think it is kind of a silver bullet in my perspective.
I got to cut you off so we can get to the next one. Sylvia.
I am really heartened to see that people in Iowa are using their critical skills and not buying into propaganda. And I would urge everybody to read a paper I wrote this summer. It's out in Frontiers in Sustainable Food Systems. It's titled, "What Decades of Policies Aimed at Agricultural Water Pollution Can Teach Us About Agricultural Climate Change Mitigation." And it's open access. Go read it.
Okay. Scott, you've got the last word here.
Yes. One thing that I've been encouraged by is we have a lot of retail agronomy folks coming to us now to learn more about our programs and the benefits of conservation. And that's been very encouraging. They're wanting to learn our ways that they can work with their producers and encourage them to adopt more conservation practices on their farms. We have over 300 partners in the state that are dedicated to conservation, and I work with them daily. And I can just say that it's been a blessing to work with these folks and trying to make a better place for us all to farm and to live.
That's great. We went right up to the wire here because it's such a great conversation. Thank you so much to our panelists, Ruth Rabinowitz, a farmer and conservationist, Scott Cagle with the National Resources Conservation Service, Sylvia Secchi with the University of Iowa, and Mitchell Hora of Continuing Ag in Washington County. Thanks also to our event sponsor, ITC Midwest. The next session in the Energy and Environment track is at 9:40, and it's called Trucks, Trains, and Pipelines, Transporting Hazardous Materials. Given the huge interest in the CO2 pipelines and controversy surrounding them, I hope a lot of folks tune in. So thank you, everyone, and thanks again to our panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.